The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March of 2014, and Ruth Calloway pressed it flat against the kitchen table with both palms the way you'd hold down a map in wind. She didn't open it right away. She stood there in the gray morning light, her hands still damp from the rain barrel she'd been hauling from the back porch, and she looked at the return address from the Carter County Agricultural Extension Office, and she let out one long breath that fogged the cold window glass beside her. That letter would sit on that table for 6 days before she touched it again. And when she finally did, what she found inside would become the thing she carried in her coat pocket every day for the next 5 years, through every frost warning and every failed graft and every Tuesday morning when someone in town looked at her like she was a woman who had lost more than just her husband. But that is not where this story starts. This story starts the autumn before, when Ruth Calloway planted 214 bare root apple trees on a hillside that 3 different men had already told her was good for nothing. The hillside faced northeast in the high hollows of Carter County, Tennessee. The kind of land that sits in shadow until almost 10 in the morning, where the frost lingers 3 weeks past what the county extension office lists as last frost date, where the soil is a dark chert-heavy clay underneath a thin skin of leaf duff that has been building quietly since before anyone's grandfather was born. The neighbors called it the cold shoulder. Had called it that for as long as anyone could say. Old Ben Mabry, who ran the feed store in Elizabethton, had pointed at that hillside once from the road and said it with the air of a man settling a matter that had never really been in question. Cold shoulder. And by that he meant the land itself had turned its back on the idea of farming. Ruth had bought the property 18 months after her husband Daniel passed. 41 acres, most of them vertical, purchased at the estate auction of the Hicks family for a price that made her sister Lorena go quiet on the other end of the phone and then say, very carefully, that she hoped Ruth was sleeping enough. Ruth was 44 years old. She had been a county librarian for 16 years. She had also, in those same 16 years, been reading, slowly, methodically, the way a person reads when they are building something invisible inside themselves, every book and journal and agricultural monograph she could find about heritage apple cultivation in the southern Appalachian Mountains. The university library in Johnson City had come to know her by name in the periodical stacks. She had been on a first-name basis with a retired pomologist named Gil Reeves in Asheville who sent her photocopied pages from British Heritage variety catalogs in manila envelopes marked with post-it notes in green ink. She had, in short, been preparing for a thing that no one around her knew she was preparing for, because Ruth Calloway had always done her most important work quietly. The bare root trees she planted that October were not the common varieties. She had driven 6 hours round trip to a heritage nursery outside Hendersonville, North Carolina, to pick them up in the bed of her old F-150, wrapped in wet burlap and brown paper. She planted Ralls Genet, a variety Jefferson had grown at Monticello. She planted Esopus Spitzenburg, the one that Lewis and Clark carried west. She planted Winesap and Limbertwig and the Carter County Golden, a variety that a local family named Tipton had kept alive through grafted cuttings for over 120 years and that Ruth had tracked down through 6 months of patient correspondence with a man who ran a heritage orchard program at Western Carolina University. She planted Swiss Gourmet and Black Twig and Gold Rush and a little-known Tennessee keeper called the Nickajack that ripened late into November and stored through February without cellaring, tasting sweeter in January than it had in October. She planted them in rows that followed the contour of the hillside rather than running straight down the slope, because she had read enough about Appalachian terroir and cold air drainage to know that frost pooled in the low spots and that the northeast aspect, while shortening her growing season, would also slow the trees' spring blooming by 2 to 3 weeks, which meant they would almost never suffer the late April frost that killed the blossoms on the standard orchards in the valley. Below. What looked like a disadvantage from the road was, to Ruth's reading, a protection. She was 3 hours into planting when Walt Greer drove by on the county road. Walt ran the largest conventional apple operation in the valley, 400 acres of Gala and Honeycrisp on south-facing slopes with drip irrigation and a contract with a regional grocery chain out of Knoxville. He slowed his truck at the fence line and watched her for a moment. Then he pulled over and got out, and he stood at the fence with his thumbs hooked in his belt and he looked at her rows of knee-high bare root whips and he looked at the northeast hillside and then he looked at her. Them heritage trees? He said it the way a person states a diagnosis. Ruth kept planting. Her spade went in, opened the soil, she lowered a tree, she firmed the earth back with her boot heel. She said yes. Cold shoulder won't fruit heritage. He said it with a kind of gentle finality, the tone a man uses when he genuinely believes he is doing someone a kindness. That aspect, that clay, this county's whole history, this land doesn't grow anything worth selling. He paused. What are you putting in, 30, 40 trees? You'll get some fruit, sure. But a commercial operation? He shook his head. Ruth, you need south-facing for reliable cropping on heritage. These old varieties, they want sun. You're going to have a lot of money tied up in trees that'll give you a bushel and a half every other year. She thanked him. She kept planting. He stood there another moment and then he got back in his truck. That conversation, she would later say, was the polite one. The less polite one came 3 weeks later at the Carter County Farm Bureau meeting in Elizabethton, in the basement of the First United Methodist Church where they always met in November, the folding chairs arranged in rows and the smell of old coffee and someone's good coat dried out by the heat vent. Ruth had come to ask about a cost-share program through the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which offered partial funding for fruit tree establishment on marginal lands. She had done the paperwork. She had her soil reports and her planting plan and her variety list and a 5-year projected revenue model that she had built using published data from the Southern Appalachian Heritage Apple Cooperative and adjusted for her specific microclimate. The county extension agent at that time was a man named Harold Pruitt, who had held the position for 22 years and who wore short-sleeved button-down shirts in all seasons and who had a way of tilting his head when he was about to disagree with you that made it look like sympathy. He tilted his head at Ruth's folder. He said the NRCS cost share was designed for financially viable operations. He said that 200 heritage trees on a northeast aspect in the high hollows was, with respect, not a financially viable operation by any standard metric he was aware of. He said that the local market for heritage apples was, in his experience, limited. He said that farmers' markets in this region had a limited draw, that the specialty food market was primarily an urban phenomenon, and that the counties she would be looking at, Carter, Johnson, Unicoi, Washington, simply did not have the consumer base for what she was describing. He said all of this very kindly. Several of the men around the table nodded. Ruth asked if she could leave her materials for the file. Harold Pruitt said of course. She drove home in the dark on Route 19E with the heater running and the radio off, and she did not cry, though later she would say she had wanted to. She had wanted to for about 45 seconds somewhere near the Roan Mountain Junction, and then something settled back down into place in her chest, the way a load shifts and resettles on a truck bed, and she drove the rest of the way thinking about cold air drainage patterns and the Nickajack apple's cold hardiness rating and the fact that Gil Reeves in Asheville had once told her, in one of his green ink post-it notes, that the best Appalachian heritage orchards had all started on land that someone else had given up on. She planted the last of the 214 trees the first week of November, just before the ground hardened. The letter from the Carter County Extension Office that arrived the following March informed her that her NRCS cost-share application had been denied on the basis of insufficient commercial viability documentation. She read it once, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket. Her coat that year was a dark green canvas barn coat, the kind with the corduroy collar that absorbs cold and smells of wood smoke by November. She wore that coat every day for the next 5 years. She folded the letter so that the words insufficient commercial viability faced outward when she put it back in her pocket, which was either masochism or the behavior of someone who understood exactly how to use a wound. Year 1 on the cold shoulder was about survival, for the trees and for Ruth both. She was still working full-time at the library, leaving at 5:15 and driving straight to the hillside, working in the long spring evenings until the light went, then working again on weekends. She mulched every tree individually with wood chips from a tree service in Elizabethton that she had arranged to take their material for free, hauling it in her truck bed 3 loads at a time. She ran a single strand of electric fencing around the perimeter because the deer population in that hollow was serious, and she learned this not from a book but from the way the browse pressure showed on the saplings in early June, the terminal buds nipped clean. She reinforced the fence and lost only 11 trees in that first year, 9 to deer, 2 to a late May frost that settled into one low corner of the property she had underestimated. She moved the 2 frost-vulnerable rows in year 2. Hand-dug, balled and burlap, replanted 15 feet upslope. The trees sulked for a season but recovered. She did not spray pesticides. This was not performance, it was calculation. She had read extensively about integrated pest management for heritage varieties and had concluded that the thick bark and tight cell structure of old variety apples, selected over centuries before synthetic inputs existed, carried a natural resilience that modern commercial varieties had been bred away from. She used kaolin clay applied as a spray during the codling moth flight window. She introduced a beneficial insect hedgerow along the upper fence line, wild bergamot, goldenrod, mountain mint, that she seeded herself from a packet mix she'd ordered from a native plant nursery in Abingdon, Virginia. She ordered a dozen mason bee houses and installed them on the south faces of the wooden posts along her fence line to supplement pollination. She kept records in a cloth-covered ledger she bought at the Carter County drugstore. Bloom dates for each variety. Frost events. Rainfall. Pest pressure. Fruit set by row. She had 6 ledgers by year 3. The trees began fruiting modestly in year 2, a few dozen apples here and there, enough to confirm that the varieties were healthy and true to type, not enough to sell. In year 3, the precocious varieties, Gold Rush, Winesap, the Carter County Golden, came in with small but promising crops. Ruth sold what she had at the Elizabethton Saturday Market, which in those years ran from a parking lot on Elk Avenue from 8 until noon. She had 1 folding table, a hand-lettered sign, and a small printed card for each variety that she had made at the library with the printer they kept for public use, each card listing the variety name, its approximate origin date, its flavor profile, and 1 historical note. The Gold Rush card said, released 1994 by Purdue University and the USDA, selected for high vitamin C content and exceptional storage, this apple improves for months after harvest. The Carter County Golden card said, preserved by the Tipton family of Carter County since before the Civil War. One of fewer than 20 known survival specimens of this variety in commercial production. People stopped and read the cards. Then they picked up the apples and smelled them, the way people do when something tells them they are holding something rare. The Winesap sold out first, every Saturday, to a woman from Johnson City who came every week without fail and who eventually told Ruth she was buying them for her mother, who was 91 and who had grown up on a farm where a winesap tree had grown by the front gate and who had not tasted one in 40 years. Ruth heard that and felt something shift in her understanding of what she was actually doing. Year 3 brought in $1,400 in market sales. Year 3 was also when Priscilla Branch first stopped at her table. Priscilla ran the purchasing for a specialty food distributor based in Asheville that supplied farmers markets and independent grocery stores across western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, and southwestern Virginia. She was 53 years old and drove a silver Subaru and wore practical boots and had a reputation in the regional food world for finding producers a decade before anyone else did. She tasted a Gold Rush and a Nickajack and an Esopus Spitzenburg standing right there in the Elizabethton parking lot on a cold October morning, and she said nothing for a long moment after the third one. Then she said she would like to come see the orchard. Ruth said she was welcome. Priscilla came the following Saturday, and she walked every row of the hillside in the October light, which in Carter County in October is the color of old brass, long and low and making even the clay soil look warm. She asked about spray records, about variety selection, about Ruth's reasoning for the northeast aspect. Ruth explained the frost protection. She explained the delayed bloom window. She explained that the northeast light, though shorter in duration, was lower in angle during the critical ripening period, which slowed sugar development and extended the flavor complexity window, the same principle that made north-facing European vineyard sites, in the right conditions, produce more nuanced fruit than their sun-drenched southern counterparts. Priscilla listened without writing anything down. Then she asked what Ruth's year 4 crop projection looked like. Ruth opened the ledger she'd brought in her canvas bag and showed her the row-by-row data from years 1 through 3, the variety by variety fruit set progression, and a conservative projection for year 4 that assumed 20% crop increase per mature tree and a first substantial harvest from the late-blooming varieties, Ralls Genet, Limbertwig, Black Twig, which were still 2 years from peak production. Priscilla looked at the ledger the way she'd looked at the knickerjack. For a long quiet moment. "You built this yourself?" "Not a question." Ruth said she had. "What do you need to scale?" Ruth said she needed a cold storage unit, a proper one, not the root cellar she'd been using, and about $14,000 in additional equipment, bins, a small sorting table, a used hand press for juice, basic packaging for storage varieties being sold late season. Priscilla said she could offer her a purchase agreement for year 4, contingent on a minimum delivery of 800 bushels across 6 specified varieties, with a per bushel price 40% above standard market rate given the heritage and spray-free certification. She said she had buyers at markets in Asheville, Knoxville, and Roanoke who had been asking her for exactly this kind of product for 3 years and whom she had nothing to offer because no one in the region was producing it at volume. Ruth stood on her hillside in the October light and did not say anything for what felt like a full minute. Then she said she would need to think about it. Priscilla handed her a card and walked back down to her Subaru and drove away. And Ruth stood there alone on the cold shoulder with the light going brass and then copper and then the gray of an old coin, and she put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the folded letter from the Carter County Extension Office against her fingertips. Insufficient commercial viability. She left the hillside at dark and drove home and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had pressed the letter flat with wet palms 2 years before, and she got out a yellow legal pad and she worked the numbers for 4 hours straight. She called Priscilla the next morning. What came next was the hardest year, and Ruth would say this clearly and without any softening when she told the story later. Year 4 was the year she stopped sleeping well, the year her back went bad from the sorting work, the year she took a part-time leave from the library and felt the particular vertigo of a person who has stepped off a ledge and has not yet determined whether they can fly or not. She found a used walk-in cooler from a restaurant in Kingsport that had closed, and she and her neighbor Calvin Pridemore spent 3 weekends installing it in the old stone spring house at the bottom of her property, running a new electrical line from the meter box up at the road. Calvin was 71 years old and had been a dairy farmer and was retired in the specific way of retired farm people, which is to say he was never actually idle, just redirected. He worked alongside Ruth without comment or credit, and when she tried to pay him for his time he said he would take a half bushel of knickerjack in January if she had them. She gave him 3 bushels. He cried a little, which he covered by going back to check the cooler thermostat a second time. The spring of year 4 was wet and cold in a way that made everyone in Carter County anxious. Rainfall for April was 1/3 above average. The valley orchards, including Walt Greer's Honeycrisp blocks, took a heavy hit from fire blight, a bacterial disease that loved wet spring weather the way a wound loves infection. Ruth had been watching the blight pressure all spring. She had applied copper sulfate spray twice in March during the identified infection windows, a technique she'd learned from a heritage orchard management guide published by Cornell University's pomology program. Her northeast aspect, which kept her blooms delayed by 16 days compared to the valley floor, meant her trees were not yet in the open flower stage during the worst of the infection weather. They bloomed into a drier, cooler May. Her fire blight rate that spring, for trees affected out of 214, all caught early and pruned back to clean wood. Walt Greer lost 30% of his Honeycrisp block. He didn't say anything to her about it, but she heard through Ben Mabry at the feed store, and she felt no satisfaction in hearing it, only a quiet recognition that the land she was working had been protecting her in ways she had chosen to trust without being able to prove she should. The harvest that fall was the harvest. She and Calvin's granddaughter, a 20-year-old named Sophie who drove down from her college in Boone on weekends to help, picked for 4 solid weeks beginning the 3rd week of September and running into late October for the keeper varieties. The gold rush didn't come in until the 1st of November. Ruth worked every day, dawn to dark, with a headlamp on in the morning to start before the light came. She wore the green canvas coat. She sorted in the stone spring house by lantern light some evenings when the days ran short. The final tally for year 4, 1,042 bushels across 9 varieties, stored in the cooler in wax-lined bins labeled in Ruth's handwriting. She had promised Priscilla 800. She had grown 242 bushels past that number in the first year of real production. She called Priscilla the first week of October, when the cooler was half full and she could see where the final count was heading, and she gave her an updated projection. Priscilla was quiet for a moment and then she said that was not a problem. She said in fact she had 2 new market contacts she'd been holding back because she hadn't wanted to overcommit Ruth in year 1. She said did Ruth want to hear about them? Ruth was standing in the doorway of the springhouse with her hand braced against the stone and the smell of cold apples coming up around her, that particular smell of cold stone and ripe fruit that has no name in English but which Ruth associated with something very old, something that had been happening in these mountains long before anyone she had ever met was born. She said yes. The delivery to Priscilla's distribution network began the 3rd week of October. 12 markets across 3 states, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia. The bins went out in Priscilla's refrigerated van and came back empty, which was a sentence Ruth had to say out loud to herself once, standing alone in the springhouse, just to hear how it sounded. The bins came back empty. The gross revenue for year 4, $22,480. For a woman who had spent 4 years being told she was pursuing a financially unviable enterprise, that number felt less like profit and more like evidence, the kind of evidence that has been building quietly in the dark for a long time and then steps into the light looking like it was always there. She paid Calvin in Nickajack and also in a check that he tried to refuse and that she wrote out and left under his windshield wiper when she knew he was inside having his supper. But the number wasn't the thing. The thing was the call she got in late November of year 4, from a woman in Asheville who ran a market stand and who had sold the last of Ruth's Esopus Spitzenburg to a man who had driven 2 hours from Charlotte specifically because a friend of his had told him about them. The woman in Asheville said her customers had been asking every weekend when the next delivery was coming. She said she had a waiting list. She said she had not had a waiting list for a produce item since the year she'd had a small farm selling heirloom tomatoes back in 2009, and that had been the best year of her business life. She asked if Ruth was planning to expand. Ruth looked out her kitchen window at the cold shoulder, bare and dark in November, 214 trees standing in their rows on the hillside like something that had always been meant to be there. She said she had some thoughts about that. She expanded in year 5. Not recklessly, Ruth Calloway had never done anything recklessly in her life, which was different from saying she had never done anything that looked reckless from the outside. She butted out an additional 80 trees on the upper section of the hillside that had been too steep to work with standard equipment but that she had found a solution for after a long conversation with an orchard consultant at the Southern Appalachian Heritage Apple Cooperative meeting in Hendersonville the previous spring. The solution was a tracked platform, a small piece of equipment used in Swiss mountain vineyards, available used from a company in Vermont, that could work the steep grade without risk of tipping. She financed the equipment purchase against year 4's revenue without borrowing a cent from anyone. She added a juice pressing operation, converting the rest of the old springhouse into a working cidery that was not a commercial cidery. She did not have the licensing for fermentation, but which produced sweet cider and blended varietal juice that went out through Priscilla's network under Ruth's own label, which she designed herself at the library's computer terminal one evening after closing using a simple font and a hand-drawn image of an apple branch that Sophie had sketched on a napkin at the harvest table and which Ruth had thought was too beautiful to throw away. The label said, Cold Shoulder Heritage Orchard, Carter County, Tennessee. Established 2013. And under the variety name on each jar, a short line. The Gold Rush jar said, grown on the hillside everyone said wouldn't grow anything worth selling. She had to have that last line approved by Priscilla's marketing contact, a young woman in Asheville who called her twice to make sure she understood it would be on a commercial product. Ruth said she understood. The young woman said, after a pause, that she thought it was perfect. By the end of year 5, the September through November harvest of 2018, Ruth Calloway's Cold Shoulder Heritage Orchard was supplying fresh fruit, pressed cider, and packaged storage apples to 41 farmers market locations across Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. 41 market locations in 3 states, moving product every week from the 3rd Saturday of September through the last market day of February, because the Nickajack and the Gold Rush and the Ralls Genet stored well enough that she had product when nobody else did, in the deep winter months when the market shelves were bare and people were hungry for something that tasted like it had come from the earth and not from a warehouse in Florida. Gross revenue year 5, $61,030. She called Lorena to tell her. Lorena, who had gone quiet on the phone when Ruth bought the property 6 years before, was not quiet this time. She made a sound that was something between a laugh and a sob, which was the sound of a sister who had watched you walk out on a long dark road alone and who had not been able to do anything but wait at the end of it. Ruth said it wasn't the money that mattered. Lorena said she knew that. She said she'd known it since the day Ruth had driven 6 hours for bare root trees wrapped in wet burlap and come home in the dark with muddy boots looking like a person who had just done something they were not going to stop doing. Ruth laughed, which she did not do often enough. It came out of her the way light comes out of a window you've walked past 100 times and then notice on a particular evening, when the angle is just right. The week after that phone call, the 2nd week of December 2018, on a Tuesday morning, in the same gray light that had been falling on Carter County since November, Harold Pruitt from the Extension office drove up her gravel lane in his county truck. She saw him from the kitchen window before he knocked. She had the kettle on. She was wearing the green canvas coat because she'd been out to the springhouse earlier and had not yet taken it off. She let him knock twice before she opened the door. Harold Pruitt was not a bad man. She had always known this. He was a man who had learned what he knew from one set of models and had applied those models consistently and without malice, and the models had been wrong in this case, and he was standing at her door in December knowing that she knew it. He held his hat in both hands. He was wearing a wool cap, the kind men in Carter County have worn since before anyone could remember, dark gray with a small brim, and he said he had been hearing things about her operation. He said there was a new USDA specialty crop block grant opening up in January. He said he wondered if she'd be interested in the information. Ruth looked at him for a moment. He had a particular expression that she recognized as the thing a man wears when he has rehearsed several versions of what he was going to say and has ended up saying none of them. She told him to come in. She put a cup of coffee in front of him and she sat across the table from him and he explained the grant program, which was real and substantive, up to $30,000 for specialty crop producers documenting unique regional varieties, with a heritage apple program specifically mentioned in the grant language. He said her operation was exactly what the program was looking for. He said her variety documentation, her 6 ledgers of data, her spray records, her variety origin cards, all of it was the kind of institutional knowledge the USDA Heritage Crop Initiative was trying to preserve and support. He did not say he had been wrong in 2014. He did not apologize or explain or offer anything that could be taken as a formal acknowledgement of anything. But he held his hat in his hands the whole time he talked, which was something. When he left, Ruth stood at the window and watched his truck go back down the lane, and she felt something that was not satisfaction and was not resentment and was not forgiveness either, or not yet, something quieter than any of those. The feeling of a thing that has been resolved in the only way that actually resolves things, which is by the passing of enough time and the doing of enough work. She applied for the grant. She got it. $27,000, disbursed in February of 2019, which she used to build a proper equipment shed, purchase an additional cold storage unit, and fund the documentation project she had been wanting to do for 3 years, a formal variety registry, with photographic and genetic records, for the Carter County Golden and 2 other regional apple varieties she had identified and preserved that had no current documentation anywhere in the National Agricultural Database. The Carter County Golden, which had existed only as a whispered name in the memories of a few old families in the High Hollows, became an officially registered heritage variety in October of 2019, with Ruth Calloway listed as the preserving producer. A copy of the registration certificate was sent to the USDA Plant Variety Protection Office in Beltsville, Maryland, and a second copy to the Germplasm Resources Information Network, where it exists in the national database alongside Ralls Genet and Esopus Spitzenburg and all the other old varieties that someone had cared enough about to refuse to let die. Ruth framed neither copy. She put them in the cloth-covered ledger where she kept her most important paperwork, the ledger from year one with the faded cover and the worn spine, the one she had bought at the Carter County drugstore when she had nothing yet to record in it except faith and observation. There is one more thing to say about that hillside, and it is the thing that Walt Greer said to her at the Elizabethton Farm Bureau meeting in the spring of 2019. He had been sitting across the room from her during the presentation she gave on heritage variety selection and Northeast aspect cultivation, a presentation Harold Pruitt had personally asked her to give to the assembled county producers, 41 people in the basement of the First United Methodist Church, the same folding chairs, the same smell of old coffee. And when it was over he had come across the room and stood in front of her and said he had been wrong in 2013. He said it plainly, looking at her. He said he had been wrong about the aspect, wrong about the varieties, and wrong about the market. Ruth said she had appreciated him stopping to talk to her that day. She meant it. He looked at her for a moment the way people look when they are not sure they've been understood correctly. Then something in him settled. He nodded once. He put his hat on and walked out, and she watched him go, and through the basement window she could see the March sky over Elizabethton, which was the pale white of old bone with one thin line of blue along the ridge, the particular sky of early spring in Carter County that means the cold is not quite done but the light is already changing. Sophie finished her degree in agricultural science at Appalachian State in May of 2019 and came back to Carter County that summer. She came back to work the cold shoulder full-time, which she had been talking about doing since year 4. Ruth gave her a salary and a stake, 15% of the operation, vesting over 5 years, which a lawyer in Elizabethton drew up properly. Sophie's first full season, she introduced a grafting program to propagate the Carter County Golden onto rootstocks they were raising themselves, with the goal of being able to supply scion wood to other producers in the region who wanted to grow the variety. In the second year of that program, they shipped scion wood to 11 orchards across 4 states. Ruth went to each of those orchards, when she could, during the dormant season, the months when her own trees were bare and the hillside was a geometry of dark branches against pale sky. She went to see the grafts take hold, the young wood knitting itself to the rootstock, the first flush of growth in spring that told you the graft had worked. She stood in other people's orchards in other counties and watched that process and felt something she could not have named at 44 and could name at 50, the specific satisfaction of a thing moving through the world under its own power, needing nothing further from you, already becoming more than you had been. The women who ran some of those orchards, and several of them were women, because the specialty and heritage food world had been filling for a decade with women who had read the same books in the same county libraries and drawn the same quiet conclusions. Some of them asked her how she had started. Some of them had their own extension office letters in their coat pockets, their own Harold Pruitts, their own Walt Greers. Some of them had hillsides that everybody said were good for nothing. Ruth told them about the northeast aspect and the delayed bloom window and the frost protection of the cold shoulder. She told them about kale and clay and mason bees and the hetero mix from the Abingdon nursery. She told them about the Nickajack's January sweetness and the Carter County Golden's root and what it meant to have a variety registered in your name. And sometimes, when the conversation had gone long and the light was going and they were standing in dormant rows with their breath making small clouds in the cold air, she would tell them about the letter. She would take it from her coat pocket. It had been refolded so many times along those same creases that the paper had gone soft as cloth at the folds, and she would hold it for a moment without unfolding it. Insufficient commercial viability. She never read it aloud. She did not need to. The orchards around them said everything the letter had failed to understand. There is a particular Tuesday every March when the light in Carter County comes back at a different angle, not warmer yet, not spring yet, but shifted, arriving through the kitchen window 3 minutes earlier than it did the week before, falling at a new slant across the table. Ruth has noticed this for years now. It happens around the second week of March, and it happens whether the ground is frozen or thawed, whether the year has been cruel or kind, whether she is tired or rested. The light does not wait for permission. It simply arrives and falls where it falls and says what it says. On the second Tuesday of March, 2020, exactly 6 years after the Extension Office letter arrived, Ruth Calloway was at the kitchen table before first light with her coffee and her newest ledger, going over the Scionwood shipment records from the previous winter. The kitchen was warm. The cold shoulder outside the window was invisible in the dark, but she knew every tree on it the way you know a thing you have touched in the dark 1,000 times, by shape and weight and the particular resistance of its bark under your palm. The light came at 6:47. It came through the east window at the new March angle and fell across the kitchen table and across her hands and across the open ledger with its columns of variety names and graphed dates and destination orchards. It lit up the grain of the old wood table the way it had been doing every morning for as long as Ruth could remember, and it fell on the green canvas coat hung on the peg by the door, the same coat, the coat with the corduroy collar and the worn left pocket, and she looked at that coat for a moment. She got up and crossed the kitchen and put her hand into the pocket of the coat. The letter was still there. 6 years of March light and October harvests and January nickajack sweetness and 41 market stands and 3 states and 11 orchards growing Carter County Goldens from her Scion wood, and the letter was still there, soft as cloth at the folds. She took it out and she stood at the kitchen window with it and she looked at the cold shoulder coming out of the dark as the light grew, the 294 trees now, 80 added over the years, standing on the hillside in their contour rows, and the first thing the light found on that hillside, as it always did, was the uppermost row, the Ralls Genet and the Limbertwig, the oldest varieties, the ones Jefferson had grown and Lewis and Clark had carried, the ones that had survived in these mountains through everything because someone in each generation had decided they were worth keeping. She unfolded the letter for the last time. She read it in the new light. Then she folded it carefully along its worn creases and she set it on the table instead of putting it back in her pocket. She set it flat on the table with both palms, the way she had the first morning it arrived, except her hands were dry now and the light was clean and she had nothing to prove to anyone, least of all herself. Outside, on the cold shoulder, the Ralls Genet and the Black Twig and the Carter County Golden stood in their rows in the first light of a March morning in Appalachian, Tennessee. And the land that everyone said had turned its back on farming was already doing what it had been doing quietly, without permission, since the fall of 2013. Waking. Holding. Growing. If you have ever been told that what you are building is not viable, by a letter, by a meeting, by someone who meant it kindly, then you already know what this story is about. The cold shoulder teaches what every marginalized hillside eventually teaches, if you stay long enough to learn it, that the aspect everyone dismisses is sometimes the one doing the protecting. Carry your knowledge quietly. Keep your records. Plant on the hillside no one else wanted. Share what you grow. If this story stayed with you tonight, share it with someone who is still planting in the dark, who has not yet seen their first harvest. Subscribe so the next story finds you when you need it.